Here, Dad, keep it. Play games on it. Stay sharp. Kevin set the USB drive on the table in front of me and turned away without looking back. The way he put it down, no eye contact, no sitting, no further word, said everything he didn't want to say straight out. I was superfluous. I was a burden. And that small black USB drive, its paint worn off with time, was the final payment for 75 years of living on this earth. It was Monday morning, January 13th. Outside the window of my small house on Castro Street, San Francisco was sinking into the thick, cold winter fog that only the Bay produces. The kind that blurs the top of the Golden Gate Bridge until well past 10 in the morning. I sat at the dining table, on both hands flat on the old wood surface, a table I'd used since 1991 when I moved into this house, and looked at the USB drive. Kevin had already left. I heard the motor of his Tesla Model S. Electric, no engine noise, just the hiss of tires on asphalt, then silence. My name is Arthur Edmund Walsh. I am 75 years old. I worked as a software engineer in Silicon Valley for 38 years, from before the profession had a clear name. I worked at IBM in 1973, then early Apple, then a series of smaller startups through the decades that followed. The ecosystem people now call Silicon Valley, and that we simply called the Bay Area. And this Monday morning, my only son had placed a worn-out USB drive on my table and told me to use it to play games and stay sharp. So this is how they repay me? To understand that Monday morning, you need to know what happened in the 6 months before it. Kevin, my son, 45 years old, came to see me for the first time in July of last year with a 30-page business plan. His startup, Nexaflow AI, was raising a Series A round. They had enterprise customers, a finished product, and just needed capital to scale. He needed $250,000 from me, a loan, not a gift, to be repaid in 12 months at 6% interest. The plan looked compelling. Kevin is not a stupid man. He studied engineering at Stanford, spent 8 years at Google before going out on his own. He knew how to build a pitch deck. He knew how to present numbers. He knew how to make an idea look like it couldn't fail. I agreed. Not because I had no questions. I had plenty of questions, and he answered most of them. But because he was my son, and I believed that a father should believe in his son. $250,000. Most of what I had saved over 38 years of work. Not everything. I'm not reckless. But most of it. 3 months later, Nexaflow AI ran out of money. Not because the product was bad. The product was actually fairly good from what I heard. But interest rates spiked, the AI market suddenly saturated after the frenzy of late 2023, and investors pulled back en masse. Kevin and his 3 co-founders watched their startup die slowly over the final 2 months of the year. My money, $250,000, vanished with it. Kevin came to see me in December to break the news. Not to apologize, or rather, to apologize in the way he thought was apologizing. A calm voice, no eye contact. Explaining the causes of failure using business terms like macroeconomic headwinds and market timing. Natalie, his wife, the woman who in 12 years of marriage had never called me anything other than Mr. Arthur, despite my repeated invitations to call me Dad, sat next to Kevin with the expression of someone in a board meeting trying to hold her face neutral. Then they started talking about making practical arrangements for me, about how the Castro Street house was too big for one old man living alone, about maintenance costs and liquidity, about a premium care facility in Daly City that Natalie had thoroughly researched. A nursing home. They wanted to put me in a nursing home, even sell the Castro Street house to cover the costs. I sat and listened to all of it without interrupting. That was a habit I developed over 38 years as an engineer. Hear everything first, then respond. Gather enough data before drawing conclusions. And then January came. That Monday morning, Kevin showed up alone. Natalie wasn't with him. Set the USB drive on the table and said the words I would not forget. Sitting alone in the living room after Kevin left, I looked at my hands. Old hands. 75 years old. Skin wrinkled, age spots that people glance at and see immediately what they want to see. Someone past his time. But these hands had typed code on green screen terminals before touchscreens were a concept anyone had. These hands had debugged programs running on computers larger than a refrigerator and 1,000 times slower than the cheapest phone on the market today. I started my engineering career in 1973 when software companies barely existed. IBM hired me to write programs for mainframe computers, machines that occupied an entire room, required constant cooling, and were used by major banks and governments to run calculations. I was 24 years old, fresh out of MIT with a PhD in computer science. In 1982, I moved to Apple. At that point, Apple was just a small company in an ordinary building in Cupertino, and Steve Jobs had just come back after being pushed out and invited back. I worked directly on the team building the operating system for the first Mac line, not in a senior role, not making the big calls, but sitting there writing code from 8 in the morning until midnight, and understanding more deeply than most people that good software is built from small details handled with care. After Apple came a string of startups over the following decades. Not all successful, but successful enough that I lived well, and built up the savings that now sat inside Kevin's failed venture. Through all those years, I raised Kevin on my own. His mother, Sandra, died when Kevin was 11 of breast cancer. It wasn't always easy. A single father in the Silicon Valley tech industry, through the 80s and 90s when work-life balance was a concept that hadn't been invented yet. There were nights I came home at 11 and Kevin was already asleep, and I'd sit by his bed watching him sleep and wonder whether I was doing this right. I paid Kevin's tuition at Stanford, 4 years, no scholarship, Stanford from 2002 to 2006. Not cheap. I never mentioned it to him in a way that demanded gratitude because children don't owe their parents thanks for things the parents chose to do. But I remembered. I remembered all of it clearly as I sat looking at that USB drive on my table, that USB drive. I looked at it without recognizing it immediately. It was old, the form factor of a drive from around 2010 or 2011, the kind of small black thumb drive people used to clip to their key rings. Kevin certainly didn't know what was on it. He had found it in one of my storage boxes while cleaning up my study. He had gone into my study without asking and straightened things up, something Natalie had presumably suggested, and assumed it was junk. Keep it, play some games. He meant I could use it for game save files the way you'd talk to a child. But I recognized that USB drive. In 2010, I was working for a small startup in Mountain View and had a colleague named Raj Patel, an Indian-American programmer, sharp, he who liked to talk about something called Bitcoin that most people in the office would politely nod at and then forget. At that time, Bitcoin was trading at about $1 a coin. Satoshi Nakamoto had published the white paper just 2 years earlier, and the global mining community was small enough that the early participants actually communicated with each other on a forum. Raj explained Bitcoin to me the way an engineer explains something, rather than the way a marketer does. Distributed data structure, proof of work, SHA, 256 encryption algorithm. I understood it immediately because I had the foundation. Not understood in the sense of, that sounds interesting, but understood in the sense of, this is a smart design and I can see why it could work. I started mining Bitcoin on my personal computer. An ordinary laptop could still do it back then because the network difficulty was low. Not because I thought I'd get rich. The real reason was simpler. I was an engineer and this was an interesting technical system. I got into it the way an engineer gets into anything interesting, to explore, to understand from the inside. From about April through September of 2010, I mined a total of 100 Bitcoin. It wasn't hard at that point, and with enough processing power and a stable internet connection, mining Bitcoin then was something like leaving your computer running a math program while you did other things. 100 Bitcoin, in worth less than $100 at the time. I saved the private key to that USB drive, a cold wallet that was crude by today's standards, but technically correct. I wrote the seed phrase on a piece of paper and put it in my important documents box. Then I forgot about it. Not completely. I knew where the USB was. But as Bitcoin climbed to $10, then $100, then $1,000, I still didn't touch it. Not because I had any strategy, but because I didn't need the money urgently and because I'd been in the tech industry long enough to know that things that rise fast tend to fall fast too. Then life kept moving. Kevin grew up. Kevin went to Stanford. Kevin graduated, joined Google, left Google, started a startup. And the USB drive sat in my storage box through all those years, unnoticed. Until Monday morning, January 13th, it's when Kevin set it on the table and told me to keep it for games. I want to say something about Sandra, because this story isn't complete without her. Sandra Marie Walsh, née Okonkwo, a second-generation Nigerian-American, was the woman I met in 1976 at a technical conference in San Jose. She was an electrical engineer at Hewlett-Packard, one of very few women of color in Silicon Valley engineering at the time, and she sat in the middle of the room and asked the sharpest question of the session after my presentation. I married Sandra in 1978. Kevin was born in 1979. Sandra died in 1990. Kevin, 11 years old, me 39. 14 years of marriage. Not long by ordinary standards, but enough for me to know what good felt like, and enough that afterward I never tried to replace it with something lesser. Raising Kevin alone after Sandra died was something I did because there was no other option, and because I loved my son. Not always done well. I worked too much in those early years, missed parent-teacher nights and soccer games and evenings when Kevin needed me and I wasn't home yet. I know that. And I think that may have left something in Kevin, something about money and security and the fear of losing things, that explains some of what happened. That's not a defense of Kevin, it's just understanding. The cherry tree in the backyard, Sandra planted it in 1989, a year before she died. She said, "Arthur, let's plant this so that every spring we have something to remind us that the most beautiful things take time." That tree has bloomed 35 springs since then. I want to say more about Kevin's business plan and about the things I noticed but chose not to acknowledge. Because this story isn't fair if I cast myself as a completely innocent victim. Kevin's Nexaflow AI pitch deck was 30 pages and professionally presented. The product was a platform helping small and mid-sized businesses automate their data analysis processes. It sounded simple but had real technical complexity behind it. The demo I saw worked well. The beta customers Kevin listed looked legitimate. But there were some things I noticed. First, the burn rate, how fast the company was spending money, was higher than normal for that stage of development. When I asked Kevin about it, he explained using phrases like senior technical talent and cloud infrastructure costs. The answer wasn't technically wrong, but it didn't answer my real question. Why was it higher than the industry average by that margin? Second, Kevin mentioned 3 other angel investors who are interested, but when I pressed for specifics, the answers were vague. After 38 years in Silicon Valley, I'd seen enough startups to know that investors who are genuinely interested have specific names, not general descriptions. Third, and this is what I kept coming back to afterward, when I asked Kevin, "If Series A doesn't come through, what's your fallback plan?" He said, "The Series A will come through." That's not an answer. That's avoiding a question by performing confidence. I saw all of that, and I agreed to lend him the money. Why? Because Kevin was my son and I wanted to believe in him. Because I had raised him alone since he was 11, and I wanted those sacrifices to mean something. Because a small part of me, the part I didn't want to admit, wanted to prove that I was still useful, that I could still contribute to something larger than myself. Those were emotional decisions wearing the clothes of rational ones, and the result is what happened. But the important point here isn't analyzing why I was wrong. The important point is, I recognized the mistake, I didn't sit there feeling sorry for myself, and I did what needed to be done next. Tuesday, January 14th. At 9 in the morning, I sat down at my desk in the small study, the room that Kevin had cleaned up and left looking the way a room looks before a house goes on the market. Tidy on the surface, but stripped of the personal touches that make a space belong to someone. I plugged the USB drive into my laptop. My laptop wasn't new, a ThinkPad from 2019 that I still use because I didn't need anything faster for what I do day to day. But it was enough to run what I needed. The USB was recognized. One file? wallet.dat. I looked at that file name and sat still for about 10 seconds. Wallet.dat, the file format used by Bitcoin Core client from the early days. I had used Bitcoin Core, the original software Satoshi wrote, to manage my wallet in 2010, and wallet.dat was where the private key was stored, and I needed to install Bitcoin Core to read this file. It took about 20 minutes to download and install the latest version of Bitcoin Core, and then import the wallet.dat file into it. While I waited, I made coffee, stood at the kitchen window looking out. San Francisco in January, the fog had lifted, pale winter sunlight. I wondered what I was hoping for. Maybe the file had degraded over the years. USB drives aren't permanent storage. Maybe the wallet was empty because someone had accessed it before. Maybe the screen displayed a notification. Import successful. I set down the coffee mug and went back to my desk. Wallet balance 100.000000000 BTC. I looked at that number, looked again, opened a second browser window and checked the current Bitcoin price. One Bitcoin was trading at $97,000. 100 Bitcoin times $97,000 equaled $9,700,000. Nearly $10 million. I sat in my small study, the study that Kevin had cleaned up to prepare for selling the house, and stared at that number in complete silence. No explosion of emotion, no shouting, no tears. I was an engineer, and an engineer verifies data before reacting to it. I spent another 30 minutes verifying, checking the transaction history on a blockchain explorer. 100 Bitcoin mined between April and September 2010, never transferred, never spent, never accessed by anyone else. Everything matched what I remembered. Then I sat back and let my thinking run where it needed to go. That Tuesday night, after confirming everything about the USB drive, I didn't go straight to sleep. I poured a small glass of whiskey, something I did when I needed to sit and think, and settled into the reading chair in the living room. I wasn't thinking about money. I was thinking about time. 100 Bitcoin had been sitting in that USB drive for 14 years. In those 14 years, Bitcoin went through cycles that people write books about. Up to $1,000, down to $300, up to $20,000, down to $3,000, up to $67,000, down to $16,000, and now approaching $100,000. 14 years of volatility that no one in the world could have fully predicted. And through all those years, I did exactly one thing: nothing. Not because I was smarter than anyone else, or because I had a superior investment strategy, but because I was busy living my life and the USB was in a box, and I didn't need the money urgently and had no reason to open it. There was an irony here I couldn't ignore. If Kevin hadn't taken my savings, if they hadn't planned to put me in a nursing home, if he hadn't set that USB on the table with those words, I might never have opened it. It might have sat in that box for another 14 years. The best thing that happened to me in this January was triggered by the worst thing that happened to me in the previous 6 months. I didn't know what to call that. Not fate. I'm not someone who believes in fate in the mystical sense. But there was something there that I kept sitting with in the Tuesday night quiet with my whiskey. Eventually, I set the glass down, turned off the light, and went to bed. In the morning, I would call James. I would do what needed to be done. Not everything needs to be understood. You just need to do the right next thing. Wednesday, January 15th, I called James Park. James Park, a Korean-American attorney, 48 years old, with an office on Market Street, had handled my legal affairs since around 2007. He was the kind of lawyer people describe as no frills. No flashy office, no expensive suits, but precise and absolutely reliable. "Arthur," he said when he picked up, "it's been a while. I heard from Kevin about the startup." "James, I need to see you today. Urgent. And please don't mention this to Kevin." A short pause. "Got it. I have an opening at 2. I got to James's office at 2 o'clock with the USB drive, my laptop, and the piece of paper with the seed phrase that I'd retrieved from my documents box. I walked him through the whole situation in about 15 minutes. No emotion, just facts in chronological order. James listened, without interrupting. When I finished, he asked, "What do you want to do?" "Two things," I said. "First, I need to move the Bitcoin safely and make sure the asset is legally secure. Second, I want to look into Nexaflow AI's debt situation, the company Kevin is defaulting on." James looked at me for a moment. "On the Bitcoin, I'll help you find a reputable custodian and get tax counsel. That's a process that needs to be done right. On the startup debt, you want to buy it?" "I want to find out who holds the largest debt position in Nexaflow AI," I said, "and whether that debt can be purchased at a reasonable discount." James nodded slowly in the way of someone assembling the pieces of a picture and seeing its shape. "You're thinking what I think you're thinking?" "Possibly," I said, "but I need the data first before I confirm. I want to say more about why I understood Bitcoin earlier than most people because that story isn't actually about luck." When Raj Patel explained Bitcoin to me in 2010, he talked about it the way a young person talks about an exciting new idea, but I was listening differently. The way someone listens who has been building software systems since the days when a single bug could bring down an entire banking operation and no one could figure out why. What I saw in Bitcoin's design wasn't something that might become valuable. That came later and was a consequence, not the cause. What I saw was a technically smart design solving a specific problem. Distributed trust without a middleman. Proof of work as a consensus mechanism. The blockchain as an immutable data structure. These were ideas that computer scientists from the 70s and 80s had been thinking about in various forms. Satoshi Nakamoto assembled them in an elegant way. "This design can work," I told Raj after reading the white paper. "The question isn't whether it works, it's who will use it and for what." The answer to that question took 15 years to fully emerge. But I got involved in that system early not because I knew the answer in advance, but because its technical design deserved an engineer's attention. That is something younger people in the tech industry sometimes forget. The most important decisions don't come from predicting the future. They come from understanding the present deeply enough. Friday, January 17th, I completed two important actions. First, I transferred the 100 Bitcoin into a custodial wallet at a reputable exchange that James had vetted. Not liquidating everything immediately. I had been in the technology industry long enough to know that big moves need to be taken step by step with expert tax counsel first. But I confirmed that the wallet worked, the private key was valid, and the 100 Bitcoin was real. Second, James, through his professional network, identified that Nexaflow AI's largest creditor was a private lending firm called Meridian Capital Group. The original loan was $1,200,000 and the company was in technical default. Meridian Capital typically sold distressed debt at a 70 to 80% discount to face value. $1,200,000 at 70% off. I could buy the position for $360,000. $360,000 months when I was sitting on nearly $10 million in Bitcoin. And as the holder of Nexaflow AI's largest debt position, I would become the priority creditor. Any major decision by the company would require my consent. Kevin and the co-founders couldn't do anything significant, including dissolving the company or selling assets without going through me. James called me Friday evening to confirm Meridian Capital was willing to discuss a sale. "Arthur, I need to remind you that this is a legally sound tactic, but it will have consequences for your family relationship. Are you certain?" "James," I said, "they took my life savings. They planned to put me in a nursing home. They wanted to sell the house I've lived in for 30 years, and they handed me an old USB drive and told me to play games." I paused. "I'm certain." "All right," James said. "We'll be ready by Monday." In the days from Wednesday the 15th to Monday the 20th, while James was handling the paperwork and I was waiting for everything to be ready, I didn't do anything out of the ordinary. I cooked for myself. I was rereading Gödel, Escher, Bach by Douglas Hofstadter, a book I first read in 1980 and still find new things in every time I return to it. I walked around the Castro neighborhood in the mornings, the daily habit I keep even on cold days. Kevin called once in those days, Thursday, I remember, to ask if I needed anything. His voice sounded like someone working through a checklist. I said I didn't need anything and thanked him. Didn't mention what was happening. There was something quiet and right about those days. I knew what I needed to know and was doing what needed to be done. But no need for anxiety or panic or inflating anything. Just let the process run at its own speed. That's something 38 years of engineering taught me, and not any specific technique, but a way of working. Debug step by step, don't assume the result before you have the data, and trust the process when the process is sound. James Park and I had worked together for almost 20 years. He knew me well enough to speak plainly, and I valued that. Friday evening, after confirming Meridian Capital was willing to negotiate, James said, "Arthur, I want to ask you something directly. Are you doing this to protect yourself or to punish Kevin?" I thought about the question for a moment before answering. "Both," I said, "and I'm not ashamed of that. But the protection matters more." "Why not the other way around?" "Because punishment doesn't give me back my savings, doesn't keep my house, doesn't actually make me feel better in the long run." I paused. Punishment is emotion. Protection is practical. I need both, but only one is truly useful. James was quiet for a moment. Then, the previous generation thought about this differently. "I know, but I've lived long enough not to let one afternoon's feelings determine what's left of my life." After that conversation, James worked quickly and precisely, which was why I trusted him for 20 years. By Friday, everything was in place. I want to say something more about Natalie because it isn't fair to the story if I only show her as a flat villain. Natalie Chen, her maiden name before she married Kevin, was a smart, ambitious woman. The daughter of Taiwanese immigrants, grew up in Fremont, studied economics at UC Berkeley, worked in finance before she met Kevin. She held values that I understood and partly respected: hard work, careful financial management, putting the family's financial security first. The problem is that good values applied to the wrong situation can produce bad results. When Natalie sat in my living room in December with a plan for practical arrangements, I don't think she was purely malicious. I think she was looking at a problem: an elderly father-in-law living alone, a failed startup. Are the family finances under strain? And finding what she thought was the optimal solution, the way someone trained in finance tends to think: consolidate assets, reduce costs, maximize liquidity. What she didn't account for, and what Kevin wasn't strong enough to remind her of, was that I wasn't a line item in a spreadsheet. I was a person. And the house I was living in wasn't an asset to be liquidated. It was where Sandra planted the cherry tree and where Kevin grew up and where I had lived for 30 years. On January 20th, when Natalie started to say, "Mr. Arthur, we were only trying to," and I interrupted, I saw in her face something I think was the first time she had actually looked at me as a person rather than a problem to be solved. That doesn't excuse what happened, but it explains part of it. An explanation is the first step toward understanding, and understanding is a precondition for repair. If anyone wants to do the repairing. Monday, January 20th. Kevin and Natalie arrived at 10 in the morning. On time, Kevin was always punctual. I had taught him that from childhood. They came with a folder of documents and the bearing of people arriving to complete a routine administrative procedure according to plan. I opened the door, invited them in, made coffee out of habit, set 3 cups on the table. Kevin placed the document folder on the table. "Dad, these are the papers for the house. There's also information about the care facility in Daly City that Natalie and I looked into. It's really a good place. They have programs." "Kevin," I said. He stopped. "Sit down." My voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. I was old enough to know that authority doesn't come from volume. Kevin and Natalie sat down. I sat across from them, hands on the table, completely composed. Before we talk about anything in that folder," I said, "I want to show you both something." I put my laptop on the table and turned the screen toward them. On the display was the custodial account interface. Clear, unambiguous, 100 Bitcoin. And beside it, the current Bitcoin price. Natalie looked at the screen first. I watched her read the number, read it again, then look at Kevin. Kevin looked at the screen. His face shifted second by second. From not understanding to beginning to understanding completely. The USB drive you gave me last week, I said, contained a Bitcoin wallet I mined in 2010. 100 Bitcoin, at the current price. I glanced at the other laptop on my desk. That is $9,700,000. No one spoke in the room. There is one more thing, I continued. Last Friday, my attorney completed the purchase of Nexaflow AI's debt position from Meridian Capital Group. $360,000 for $1,200,000 of face value debt. I looked directly at Kevin, which means as of last Friday, the largest creditor of your company is me. Kevin set his coffee cup down, slowly, carefully, like a man trying not to let his hands shake. Dad, he said, his voice changed. No longer the voice of someone completing a routine administrative procedure, but the voice of someone standing on ground that had just shifted beneath him. You can't what? I asked. My voice stayed level. Can't legally own my own assets? Can't exercise the rights of a creditor under California law? I can. I did. And the paperwork is complete. Natalie spoke for the first time. Mr. Arthur, we were only trying to... Trying to what? This time I didn't let her finish. Not from rudeness, but because I already had the answer ready for the sentence she was about to say. Trying to put me in a public nursing home after borrowing my savings and losing them in a failed startup? Trying to sell the house I've lived in for 30 years without asking me? Or trying to hand me a worn-out USB drive and tell me to play games and stay sharp? The living room was silent. Outside the window, January San Francisco was cold. Pale light filtered through the curtains. I let them sit in silence for a moment. Not to punish them, but because some things need to be sat with before moving forward. Then I said, I have no intention of destroying the company or taking back the house. I saw Kevin look up. I want to have an honest conversation with you, which may be the first genuinely honest conversation we've had in the past year. I placed a small document folder on the table. James had prepared it. This is my proposal. On the Nexaflow AI debt, I won't call the debt immediately. I'll restructure it on the condition that the company repays my original $250,000 investment over 3 years. No interest, principal only. In exchange, I waive operational control of the company. You keep your startup. Kevin looked at the documents. On the house, I continued, I won't sell. Yeah, this is my home and it will remain my home until I decide to do something different with it. I looked at Natalie. And I won't be going to any care facility. I'll hire private support if I need it. And I have the financial means to do that. Dad, Kevin said, his voice lower. I didn't know that USB drive. I know you didn't, I said. If you had known, you wouldn't have given it to me. I paused. But that doesn't change what happened. You took my money and lost it. You had a plan to move me without asking what I wanted. You were going to sell the house I live in without consulting me. I understand you were under pressure, and I understand not all of it was malicious, but it happened. Kevin said nothing. I'm not going to tell you what to do, I said. You're 45 years old, you already know. But I want you to understand this. I am not a confused old man. I am not a burden to be managed. And I am certainly not someone who needs other people to decide where he will spend his remaining years. Kevin and Natalie left at 11:30 in the morning. Nothing was signed. The folder of documents about the house and the care facility stayed on the table. They didn't take it with them. I sat alone in the living room and finished the cup of coffee that had gone cold. Looked out the window. San Francisco in January, the sun higher now, the morning fog completely gone. It wasn't victory in the sense of feeling good. There was no moment of gleeful satisfaction. Just a sense that something heavy had been dealt with, and I knew what I needed to do next. In February, I did three major things. First, I worked with James, and a tax specialist, to handle the Bitcoin conversion in a legally sound and tax-efficient way, not liquidating everything at once. I converted a portion for liquidity and kept the rest as a digital asset in a high-security custodial wallet. Total spendable after tax, approximately $4 million. Enough to do everything I wanted to do with the rest of my life. Second, I hired a private house manager. Not a nurse or a caregiver in the purely medical sense, but comprehensive support. Groceries, cooking, driving, administrative tasks, keeping the house running smoothly. I interviewed 4 candidates and chose a man named Marcus, 42 years old, with experience supporting independent older adults and, specifically, enough technical knowledge that he didn't look at me the way people look at old men who don't understand computers. Third, I booked a first-class seat to Tokyo. Tokyo was a place I had wanted to visit since 1985, when I was reading about Japanese technology culture during the consumer electronics boom. Never had the time. Always a reason to wait. And now I was 75, healthy according to my doctor, and had enough money to fly first class. Not business class, first class, with a fully flat bed and champagne at 11 at night if I wanted it. On the morning of February 28th, Marcus drove me to San Francisco International Airport. First class seat on an ANA flight to Tokyo Narita. I settled into my seat, let the flight attendant hang my jacket, accepted a glass of chilled sparkling water, and looked out the window. Before the plane began taxiing, I checked my phone. There was a text from Kevin sent early that morning. Dad, I signed the debt restructuring agreement. I'm sorry. I read that message once. Put the phone down. I would respond later, when I got back. After I had stood in front of Sensoji Temple in Asakusa and drunk real matcha in Kyoto and ridden the Shinkansen from Tokyo to Osaka and done all the things I had postponed for 40 years because there was always work to be done, then I would respond. After January 20th, I sat down and wrote a letter to Kevin. Not to send, at least not then, but to put what I wanted to say into a clear shape, because sometimes writing things out helps you understand what you actually think. I wrote about the evenings he fell asleep in the car when I was driving him home after working late, and he couldn't keep his eyes open. I wrote about the first time he wrote code. 12 years old, I showed him how to build a simple program in BASIC on an old computer, and he sat there for 3 hours without eating dinner because he was completely absorbed. I wrote about the way he used to ask me technical questions when he was in college. Good questions. The questions of someone who was genuinely thinking through the problem. I also wrote about what had happened, not in an accusatory way, but analytically. What led to this, what each side had done and not done, what might have been different if. At the end of the letter I wrote, Kevin, I don't know where we go from here. That is something I don't know at 75 that I didn't know at 30. That relationships between real people are genuinely complicated and no one can program them to run according to a script. I only know that I want to live the years I have left the way I choose to live them. And I hope you build something truly good. Not because I want you to succeed so I can be proud, but because I believe that when you're doing something genuinely well, you're the best version of yourself. I folded the letter and put it in my desk drawer. Not sent. Maybe I'll send it someday. Maybe I won't need to because I'll say what's in it in person when the time is right. But writing it helped me, and that was enough. People tend to think of Silicon Valley as a place where young geniuses change the world in garages. That story isn't entirely wrong, but it leaves out most of the truth. Silicon Valley was really a place where ordinary people sat debugging code from 8 in the morning until midnight and wondered why a particular function wasn't behaving the way it was supposed to. It was long meetings about architecture decisions that sometimes ran 3 hours and ended with a choice that everyone knew was imperfect, but was the best available given the circumstances. It was release deadlines and bugs that only showed up in production and never reproduced in the test environment. IBM in 1973 was a different world. Computers larger than refrigerators, machine rooms needing their own air conditioning, Every CPU hour billed out and everyone knowing that wasting compute resources was a professional sin. What IBM taught me, and what no university course teaches adequately, was the discipline of a programmer who knows that resources are finite and that every technical decision has a cost. Apple in 1982 was completely different. Jobs was back, and with him came the pressure of someone who wanted everything not just to work, but to be good. Good in the sense that an end user shouldn't need technical knowledge to use it. Good in the sense that the interface and the experience were part of the product, not an afterthought layered on top. I remember a meeting where Jobs walked in unexpectedly, looked over my shoulder at my screen and said, "Why is this section so complicated?" I explained the technical reasoning. He was quiet for a moment. He then said, "I didn't ask why it's complicated. I asked why you chose the complicated way instead of the simple one." That lesson I carried through the rest of my career. Complexity is not evidence of intelligence. Simplicity is. Over 38 years, I worked through every phase of this industry. I watched COBOL give way to C, C give way to Java and C++, then Python and JavaScript, and new languages appearing continuously. I watched mainframes yield to PCs, PCs yield to networks, networks yield to cloud computing. I watched AI go from academic theory to the moment ChatGPT appeared, and everyone suddenly realized that what we had been researching and building in the dark for decades had arrived at its moment. Through all that change, what didn't change was the nature of problem-solving work. Understand the problem fully before proposing a solution, test your assumptions, and don't let confidence interfere with care. That was what I wanted Kevin to learn. Not from this story if it could have been avoided, but ideally much earlier. I said that I didn't explode or shout or cry when I saw 9,700,000 on the screen. That's true, but it doesn't mean I felt nothing. It just means my emotions don't express themselves that way. The first thing I felt wasn't joy or relief. It was something more complicated. Sadness. Sad because that USB drive had been sitting in my box for 14 years and no one in the family, including me, had paid any real attention to it until it was used as a psychological weapon in those words, "Stay sharp." Sad because this story should not have unfolded this way. The second emotion was anger. Not erupting anger. The kind that leads to bad decisions. But the cold, clear anger you feel when you understand fully what happened and know it shouldn't have. And the third emotion, the one that came last and mattered most, was determination. I was 75 years old. I didn't have as much time left as when I was young. Every day I had was a day I wanted to live on my own terms, not according to someone else's plan. And that USB drive, whether by accident or by some strange alignment, had given me the chance to do exactly that. When I called James Park on Wednesday morning, my voice was level, not because I had no feelings, but because I had worked through them during Tuesday night. Lying in the dark of my quiet bedroom, letting everything run through my head in its own order until it settled and I could see more clearly. That is a skill. Not everyone has it. And it wasn't innate. It was something I built over decades of working in an environment where panicking could genuinely take down a system. I spent 12 days in Tokyo. Akihabara, the famous electronics district I had been reading about since the 80s, was now a strange mosaic of old component shops, anime culture, and floors packed with screens and LED lighting. I walked through it one morning and found in the small dark shops on the upper floors electronic components I recognized from the 80s. Not antiques, but retro specialty shops selling classic tech. The world had turned enough full circles that things that were once the future had become nostalgia. In Kyoto, I sat in a small tea room near Ginkakuji Temple and drank matcha with a small wagashi sweet. The person preparing the tea, a woman of about 60, moved through the tea ceremony slowly and precisely, each gesture carrying its own meaning. I watched her and thought there was a parallel between a tea ceremony and good software. Attention to each small detail, patience with the process, the understanding that beautiful results come from each step done right. I didn't think much about Kevin or Natalie or Nexaflow AI during my time in Japan. Not because I was indifferent, but because I had done what needed to be done and now was the time for what I wanted to do. I want to say more about Tokyo because what happened there mattered in a different way from what happened in the living room on Castro Street. On my third day in Tokyo, I walked through the Yanaka neighborhood, one of the city's older districts, largely spared from World War II, bombing and retaining much of its traditional Taisho-era wooden architecture. Narrow streets, small shops selling ceramics and folk crafts and bread, little shrines tucked between residential buildings. I stopped in front of a small shop selling antique clocks. In the glass case was an old pocket watch in brass, the kind people used in the early 20th century. The shop owner, an old man of about 80 with reading glasses and a calm expression, sat behind the counter repairing another watch. We didn't share a language. He spoke no English and I spoke no Japanese. But I pointed to the pocket watch in the case. He took it out and we looked at it together. He opened the case and showed me the movement inside. Tiny gears operating with a precision that involved no semiconductor chips, nothing but pure mechanics. I bought the watch. Not for its collector value or because I needed a timepiece. I had my phone. But because that moment reminded me that some things made well can still run after 100 years. Not by magic, but because they were designed right and maintained right. That watch now sits on my desk, next to the USB drive. On my 7th day in Tokyo, I attended a small event about the history of the Japanese internet. Actually an informal presentation at a cafe in Jimbocho, and organized monthly by a retired Japanese engineer who wanted to tell anyone interested about Japanese tech history from an insider's perspective. I was the only non-Japanese person in a group of about 12. The organizer, Tanaka-san, 72 years old, spoke enough English for real conversation. When he learned I had worked at Apple in the 80s, he had many questions about those days. In that era, Tanaka-san said, we in Japan were building similar things. But we started from a different angle, and we thought about hardware first, software second. In America, it was the reverse. He looked at me. In the end, your approach was more right for the market at that time, but our hardware was still better. I laughed. That's still true. That was a conversation with a colleague across language and culture, about things we had both built in different ways. The kind of conversation you can only have when you've spent enough time in your field to have a history worth talking about. On my last day in Tokyo, I sat in a small, quiet garden in Shinjuku-gyoen and looked at the cherry trees that hadn't yet bloomed. Cherry blossom season was still 2 months away, but the buds were already forming on the branches. I thought about 75 years of life and what remained of it. Technology changes, startups fail, savings can disappear and return in ways no one anticipates. But grit, the ability to stay calm when the ground shifts, to gather data before reacting, to make decisions based on truth rather than fear, that doesn't change. It's what you build over years and what no one can take away. I'm writing these words on a morning in April, sitting in the backyard garden of the house on Castro Street with a cup of coffee and my old laptop. The small cherry tree Sandra planted in 1989 is in bloom. She put it there so every spring there would be something to remind us that the most beautiful things take time. Nexaflow AI is in the middle of its restructuring. Kevin is working through the repayment terms. Not quickly, but steadily. We had a real conversation in March. The first long talk between father and son that wasn't about money or plans or practical arrangements in years. Not everything is resolved. These things take time. But the door is open. Marcus manages the house well. He knows when to leave me alone when I'm working and when I might need something. That's an art that not many people have. I'm planning my next trip, Rome and Athens. I want to stand inside the Colosseum and the Parthenon and think about the civilizations that built those things. People who had no computers, no internet, no AI, but had enough intelligence and grit to create structures that have stood for thousands of years. There is one more part of this story I want to tell. Raj Patel, the colleague who had explained Bitcoin to me in 2010, was still living in Mountain View. After I had handled everything, I tracked down his contact information and called him. Raj, I'm calling to thank you. A short pause. Arthur, It's been a long time. Thank me for what? For Bitcoin. In 2010, you explained it to me. I mined 100 Bitcoin back then. A longer pause, then a soft laugh. Arthur, you didn't sell it all, did you? No, I put it in a USB drive and forgot about it. Until recently. Raj was quiet for a moment, visibly doing the math. 100 Bitcoin at today's price? Arthur, you're talking about... I know. That's why I'm calling to thank you. Raj laughed again. You're the only person I know who mined Bitcoin in 2010 and still has it. Yet most people either sold early or lost their wallets. I just followed correct technical procedure, I said. Saved the private key properly, wrote down the seed phrase, stored it safely. Not because I was prescient, just because that was the engineer's habit. The engineer's habit, Raj repeated. So many people had the same amount of Bitcoin and lost it because they didn't follow the right process. I thought about that. More than I'd like to think, probably. We talked for about another hour, about old colleagues, about how Silicon Valley had changed across the decades, about what Raj was doing now. He had retired last year and was writing a memoir about the early days of the software industry. When I hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt much recently, a connection to the past, to the people who had built something alongside me in the years when no one knew for certain where any of it was going. Raj and I made plans to have lunch next month. We'll talk about code and about Bitcoin and about all the things that people in our field talk about when they sit together. Not pitch decks or valuations or exit strategies, but interesting technical problems and elegant solutions and why some ideas work and some don't. That was the kind of conversation I had been missing. This story might look like a story about money, about $9,700,000 in Bitcoin, and about lost savings. But that's not really what it's about. It's a story about dignity. Dignity in the simplest sense. The right of a person to make their own decisions about their own life. The right to live in your own home without asking anyone's permission. The right to be consulted about decisions that affect you. The right not to be treated as a cost optimization problem when you reach 75. The most painful thing in this story wasn't losing $250,000. The most painful thing was the phrase, play games and stay sharp. 3 words that encapsulated everything Kevin and Natalie thought of me. An old man who no longer understood the world, whose opinions weren't worth hearing, who just needed to be kept busy and out of the way. The reality was that I had been working with computers before Kevin was born. I had debugged programs more complex than anything Nexaflow AI was building. I had mined Bitcoin in 2010 when Kevin himself didn't know what Bitcoin was. But I'm not telling this to boast. I'm telling it to say, we need to be careful about how our society looks at older people. There is a troubling tendency, particularly in technology industries like the one I spent my life in, to treat experience and age as liabilities to be overcome rather than assets to be leveraged. The default assumption that anyone over 60 doesn't understand new technology and needs things explained to them. The truth is considerably more complex. Some older people don't keep up and aren't willing to learn new things. That's real. But there are also people like me, who built the foundations of this industry, who learned and adapted through many cycles of technological change, who sometimes understand more deeply precisely because they've seen enough times what works and what doesn't. Don't look at age and conclude capability. I've said that 38 years of programming gave me a particular way of working. I want to be specific about what it taught, because I think those things connect directly to this story. Lesson 1. Good systems need redundancy. In engineering, you don't design a system with a single point of failure because when that point breaks, and it will, not if but when, the whole system goes down. You build backups, failovers, distributed systems so that when one thing fails, other things keep running. In life, don't put all your eggs in one basket, is the old saying expressing the same idea. I broke that principle when I put most of my savings into Kevin's startup. That was a single point of failure, and it failed in the precise technical sense. But I also had redundancy I didn't know about, the USB drive in the box. Not because I had planned for it, but because the habit of storing things correctly had created it. In engineering, sometimes you are saved by good decisions you made long ago and forgot about. Lesson 2. Read the error message carefully. In programming, when there's a bug, the system usually tells you fairly precisely what went wrong, if you read it carefully instead of just seeing error and panicking. Many engineers spend hours debugging because they don't read the error message thoroughly from the start. In life, warning signs appear before something breaks. I saw those signs in Kevin's pitch deck: high burn rate, vague answers about investors, the avoidance of questions about contingency plans, but I didn't read the error message carefully enough. I hoped they were false alarms. Lesson 3. Version control. Now, in modern software, you never completely delete old code. You save the history of changes so you can roll back if needed. You can always return to a previous version if the new one has problems. In life, the equivalent is preserving things of value from the past rather than completely discarding them to chase the new. 14 years earlier, I mined Bitcoin and stored it correctly. I was committing a decision into history that I could check out later. And lesson 4, the one I think is most important and is least often taught. Read the documentation before you write the code. Before you start building anything, understand enough about the environment you're working in, the constraints, the dependencies, what's been done before you, and why it was done that way. I didn't read the documentation carefully on Nexaflow AI before committing my savings to it. I read the pitch deck, but I didn't conduct the full due diligence of a professional investor. That was my mistake, regardless of what Kevin did afterward. Those lessons weren't new to me at 75. I had known them for a long time. What being 75 added was this: knowing a lesson and living by a lesson are two different things, and the distance between them sometimes doesn't close until you've paid the full price. There is something I want to say to anyone who reads this story, not as a moral lesson, but as what I genuinely believe after 75 years. Technology changes. Startups fail. Savings can disappear and come back in ways no one anticipated. But grit, the ability to sit still when the ground shifts under you, to collect data before reacting, to make decisions based on fact rather than fear, grit doesn't change. It's what you build over the years and what no one can take away. Kevin is talented. He studied at Stanford, worked at Google, built a real product. But he's still building the thing I'm describing. At 45, he's still learning. I hope that what happened taught him something I had no other way to teach him. Humility about risk. The understanding that what looks like it can't fail is often what fails hardest. And especially the understanding that an elderly parent's life savings is not venture capital. This morning in the garden, I hear birds in Sandra's cherry tree. The April sky over San Francisco is clear and warm in the way it gets before the summer fog starts up again. From the kitchen, Marcus is making something that smells like fresh coffee. I've booked the Rome and Athens flight for June, and the USB drive, and after everything, sits on my desk next to the antique pocket watch from Yanaka. Not for its financial value anymore, but because it reminds me that the most important things don't always look important. Technology changes, but grit doesn't.